One of the most difficult aspects of learning music production is learning all of the slang and the jargon and the terminology, because a lot of people will use tons of words, and some people will even use different words to mean the same thing, or the same word to mean different things. So one thing that I've always wanted to do is make a little video where I go over more than 50 different audio terms that I think that you should know, and I kind of want to give a little bit more context to them so you really understand them. So we're going to go over a lot of terminology in this video. So if we're moving a little bit too fast, if you want to download all of the terms, and if you want to download the glossary that we're going to be using, there will be a free link in our description where you can just grab it from our website so you can look at them on your own time. And I'm sure that I will be missing some words or phrases, so if there are things that you want to know, let us know in the comments down below, and let us know if you want a part 2 to this video. Without further ado, let's actually jump in because we have a lot to cover. We're going to start with something extremely simple. It's the term DAW, also pronounced DAW, and it stands for Digital Audio Workstation. That's the software program that you're going to use for recording, editing, mixing, and exporting your audio. My DAW of choice is Cubase. You could also use something like Logic or GarageBand or Ableton or FL Studios or Reaper. It's essentially the program that you're going to be doing all of your production work or mixing work or recording work inside. And inside of that DAW, you're going to have tools called VSTs. This is the second word. A VST is a virtual studio technology. These are software programs used to create virtual effects or instruments. So you could have VST effects, something like a compressor that is actually inside of your DAW, or you could have something like a preamp. This is a third-party one. This is by Universal Audio. Or you could have an actual virtual instrument, something like Serum or Omnisphere or Keyscape. So if I go to something like Keyscape, essentially, this is just a program where now I can play an instrument that does not have any sound actually on it, and this virtual instrument will create the sound. So there's virtual instruments for pianos, strings, synths, drums, tons of virtual instruments. And the way that you control the sound in a virtual instrument is by something called MIDI. So MIDI is essentially data that carries notational, dynamic, or expressive information. So this keyboard that I'm playing right here, it does not have any sounds physically on it. Essentially what it's doing is when I press a note, it's capturing data called MIDI, and it's converting that with a cable into my computer, and that is basically signaling Keyscape to recreate those notes. And so if I play it out, that MIDI data is going to be captured inside of my DAW, and now every time I play it back, it will perfectly recreate what I played via MIDI. The next word that we should discuss is interface. This is one of the most basic pieces of equipment that you're going to use when you're producing or recording. It's a piece of audio equipment that normally consists of preamps, inputs, outputs, and converters. And essentially, it's kind of the central hub of every studio. This is what a lot of audio is recorded into your computer through, and then it's also what audio in your computer is kind of played back through to hit something like your monitors or your speakers. So a couple kind of common interfaces that you've probably seen a million times, or you have some like the Focusrite Scarlett, you have some like the RME Babyface, the Audient ID4, the Apollos, and essentially these have a bunch of components that we're going to talk about individually real quick. Just know that an interface is kind of an all-in-one box that can do a lot of your recording capabilities inside of one thing. One area that an interface really does well on is something called conversion. So conversion is the process of turning physical audio data into digital data or vice versa. So right now I'm speaking into a microphone. This is all analog data. There's nothing digital happening. Something has to basically convert this into a digital signal that my DAW can actually understand. So for me to talk into this, hey, 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 mic check 1 2, mic check 1 2, there has to be conversion converting this audio data into digital data. To this, hey, 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 mic check 1 2, mic check 1 2. And then vice versa, for me to listen to that back, or for that to be exported back, it needs to turn that digital data back into audio data to come through speakers. So that's what's called conversion. And you're going to see something called A/D or D/A, and that simply stands for analog to digital or digital to analog. So conversion can work both ways, and typically interfaces will do that, but they also sell standalone converters that will handle conversion, sometimes at a higher quality. The next thing that you're going to see in a lot of interfaces, and something that you want to pay attention to, is ins and outs. This is also called I/O, and this can describe a myriad of different kinds of ins and outs from analog to digital. So different inputs could be something like a mic input or a line input. Different outputs could be something like a speaker output or a line output. You could also have things like ADAT input and output, and that's going to be a digital input and output. So there's a lot of I/O typically on interfaces, but pay attention because not every in means that you can necessarily plug a microphone or a guitar in, and not every out means that you can necessarily plug a speaker into them. There's very, very different things. The next phrase that I want to talk about is mic level versus line level. So I talked a little bit about how there's different I/O. So mic level is going to be a lot lower and a lot lower voltage than something like line level. So if I'm speaking into this microphone is capturing a level that is relatively low. To bring that up to something that is going to be sufficient for an interface to turn that into digital data like this, it's essentially going to need to be boosted. So a lot of the time you'll hear the word preamp, and a preamp is essentially audio equipment that's going to boost a mic input or a lower input to something like line level. So when you're looking at an interface, if you see that there's an input on the front that says mic and there's an input on the front that says line, if it says mic, that means that it normally has a mic preamp kind of built in. And if it says line level, that means that it's going to need to be input already at line level. So maybe you use something like a third-party preamp, like something like this Neve 1073. Another thing that you're going to see on interfaces is something called phantom power. You might see this indicated with a 48V, standing for 48 volts. And essentially a lot of condenser microphones will have internal components that need a little bit of extra power. And so a lot of interfaces will have something called phantom power, where it'll send an electrical impulse through the mic cable into the microphone. It'll power those internal components of that microphone, and then that microphone will now have the power that it needs to output audio. Be really careful with phantom power. You don't want to send it to something that doesn't need it, because you might blow up the internal components. The next thing that I want to talk about is the term dB or decibel. This is essentially a unit of measurement for amplitude of an audio source. You're going to see dB all over the place. It's kind of just the standard nomenclature for how loud something is. So 0 dB is going to be loud. Negative 30 dB is going to be extremely quiet. Let's talk about where things kind of start to get a little bit more complicated, and that is the term gain. So gain is the audio level or amplification of a source, and that's typically before it's hitting conversion and processing. So interfaces will all have gain. If we go back to these interfaces over here, if you turn this little knob right here up, that's going to be the gain for that input. You could think of gain as volume. There's one really important distinction behind gain, and that is that as you drive it, you might hit the maximum kind of threshold of volume that something can take before it starts saturating or clipping. You could boost something and allow it to start getting a little bit gritty and a little bit clippy, or you could turn it down and something's going to be a little bit cleaner. When we talk about the phrase clipping audio is essentially when audio exceeds the maximum headroom and starts to distort. A good example would be if I'm talking into this microphone. I'm at an okay level right now. Everything's feeling good. But if I scream really loud in it, it might start to get that kind of distortion, that clipping, that artifacting. You can't really undo that later in the process. Once audio is recorded and it's clipped, you're kind of done. So make sure that when you're adjusting your gain, you're not clipping your audio. Make sure that you have a healthy signal that's not too hot or not too loud, because you could run into issues with clipping and saturation. The next thing that I'll talk about is something called headroom. Headroom is essentially the amount of gain the audio has before it will become distorted or clip. So if we look at something like this track right here, I can barely breathe, now I'm falling to my knees. So when this says negative 2.4, that means we essentially have 2.4 dB of headroom before we start to clip it. So if I turn this up over here, you're gonna see this clip now. I can barely breathe, now I'm falling. And essentially, that's going over that threshold. You're starting to get that artifacting. So your headroom is going to be how much room you have until that starts to happen. The next thing that I'll talk about is a term called level. A lot of people will use this interchangeably with the term gain. However, they actually mean very different things, especially when you look at something like a guitar amp or a preamp. So if we look over here at a Neve 1073, you're going to see this red knob. This is essentially your gain. And like I said before, as you drive gain, you could start to impart distortion and saturation and clipping, but level is kind of just a trim knob for that. So a level is going to be kind of a knob where you can say, okay, I have that affected audio source. Now I just want to turn it up or down. This is typically not going to impart any more saturation. You're still going to have that clipping happening because it happened in the gain stage. And now essentially you're just pulling the level down so it's not quite as loud, but it will still be clipped. Next, let's talk about the term noise floor. Noise floor is essentially the level of internal background noise that an audio source or device has. So every microphone, every preamp, every interface, every speaker will have something called a noise floor. And that's essentially how much noise the components in that will output when there's no no actual sound being input into the device. So if you see something that says it has a low noise floor, that essentially means that static, that hiss, that hum, that kind of white background noise that you hear in analog equipment is going to be much lower. If something has a high noise floor, it might have a little bit of that hiss, that hum, that crackle. You're going to hear that a lot more with like analog recording equipment. Analog microphones typically have a really high noise floor. Guitars can have a really high noise floor. We're going to kick it back to something really, really basic, and that is just the term record. Record is just the process of capturing audio or MIDI data. So in your DAW, if you hit that little red button, as long as you have a track that is showing that it is record enabled or armed, you hit this, mic check 1 2, mic check 1 2. It's now capturing this audio and it's telling the DAW, remember this audio because you're going to have to play it back. You can do the same thing with MIDI. If I come up to this keyscape up here that we played, I'm recording this. So now Cubase is going to remember that I just played that. The next thing that I want to talk about is the word cut. Cut actually has a few definitions in recording. Cut could just be slang for recording. So you might hear an artist say like, oh, I'm going to go cut vocals today. That just means that they're going to go record vocals. Another phrase for the word cut is when it comes to like releasing music. So you might hear producers say, oh, I got a cut with Sabrina Carpenter. Oh, I got a cut with Justin Bieber. That just means that they got a record that was released with them. So when your song gets cut, it means that that artist is committing to releasing it. And then the last thing is actually just cutting up audio or slicing audio. So if I pull up this slice tool in Cubase, some will call it slice, some will call it split, some will call it cut. You can essentially just start to make little cuts in your audio. You can move things around. You can start to reposition it. So the word cut has a few meanings. The next word that I want to talk about is comp. This is not to be confused with compress or compression. But when somebody says the word comp, for instance, I need to comp vocals. Essentially what they're saying is I'm going to take multiple takes of this vocal or multiple versions of this vocal, and I'm going to take different elements of it and compile that into one final performance. So when I'm comping a verse vocal, let's say that the artist performed that verse vocal 12 times. I'm going to go through all 12 takes of that, and I'm going to take my favorite elements from each take, and I'm going to assemble that into one final vocal. That is a comped vocal. Let's talk about the next term, which is automate. Automate is to essentially change the values of certain parameters across time inside of your DAW. Let's say you're talking about automating a reverb. When I'm automating this, essentially what I'm going to be doing is I'm telling my DAW, hey, remember how I'm controlling these parameters over time. So let's say you want to automate the reverb up. You can automate the mix. You could automate things like volume. And you're just automating that over time. So what's really important, if you want to do automation, you're going to need to control read automation and write automation. So in your DAW, you're going to see these R's and these W's. You're going to see them on individual tracks as well. So let's say I want to record automation that I want Cubase or my DAW to remember. I'm going to control write automation. And now as this track plays, I'm going to control whatever parameters I want to automate. Shorten up the reverb. Turn it down. Turn the track volume down. Pan it to the right. So now I've written in all of that automation. I'm going to turn right off. You're going to see this green button that is read automation. So essentially, when that green button is still lit up, Cubase is going to read every move that I just made. And you can also go in and you can draw it typically yourself on lanes. I like actually controlling it with my mouse or with a controller. I find it a little bit more intuitive. But now when I play this audio back, so when people talk about automating reverb or automating an EQ or automating volume, essentially they're just controlling parameters over time. The next thing that I want to talk about is the word track. So track has a couple different definitions. The first one that I'm going to talk about is like a track inside of your DAW. Essentially, every audio source is its own track. So let's say I have a drum kit and I have an audio source for the kick drum, the snare drum, one tom, the second tom, a hi-hat, and a crash. that's going to be 7 different tracks. And what's important is that all of those tracks can kind of be processed themselves. So you can process them on an individual track level, but track can also be slang for just the word record. So if I say I need to track vocals or I need to track guitars, that just means I need to record vocals or I need to record guitar. So record, cut, and track can all kind of be used interchangeably when it's talking about performing it. The next thing that I want to talk about is the term bus. So I just talked about individual tracks inside of your DAW, but you also have something called bus tracks or group tracks or folder tracks, depending on how your DAW labels them. But essentially a bus is kind of a home base for where multiple audio sources are going to kind of come together. So if I open this, I have what's called the group synths and keys. This is a track over here, but it's actually a bus. Essentially what's happening is every time that in this session I record a key sound or a synth sound, let's say I record a piano and then a Rhodes and then a little synth pluck, I'm going to tell Cubase I want all of those to end up going to this bus track that is for my synths and keys. So I can still operate those on an individual level. I can turn the piano up, I can turn the pluck down, I can add a little bit more reverb to the Rhodes. But let's say I want to process all of those key sounds together. I'm going to do that on the actual synths and keys group or bus. Let's talk about what might be the most confusing thing that we're going to talk about today, and that is the terms send, return, aux, and effects tracks. So a send is essentially a device that your DAW will use to basically create a clone of an audio source. So if I have this little demo down here, when I'm using a send over here, it's going to create a duplicate of that, and it's going to send it out to wherever I want, which could be a return or an aux or an effects tracks. They're all called different things, but they kind of all mean the same thing. So let's say I want to send out this audio. I'm sending it to something called my vocal plate reverb. And that vocal plate reverb is its own track all the way down here. And essentially, it's never going to have audio actually on the track. It's literally just going to have a reverb. So it's going to have this. You could do this with delay, you could do this with saturation. And what's really cool about using sends and effects tracks and return tracks is now I have that reverb track. I can go in and I can process that reverb as its own audio source. I don't have to kind of use the parameters that are only inside of that reverb control. One thing that I just kind of mentioned is the terms wet and dry. Wet and dry is essentially the ratio of affected to unaffected signals. So if I open up something like that vintage verb that we just had, you're going to see something called mix. Mix is also called wet dry. They're exactly the same, but essentially this is telling it what ratio of reverb do I want to be processed. Let me turn off that send that we were just using. This is actually on the track itself. There's no reverb happening. Now it's only reverb happening. Some plugins will have mix knobs or wet dry knobs, and that can be really good for dialing in effects. However, some don't, and that would be why you use something like a send and a return track, so you can kind of control that relationship of dry to wet. One thing to kind of disclose is that when you are using something like sends and effects tracks, you're going to want that to be 100% wet, because essentially you don't want any of that dry signal in there, because you already have that dry signal. You're sending a duplicate of it. So when you use something like effects tracks and aux tracks, leave those at 100% wet or the mix knob at 100%. The next thing that I want to talk about is the word bounce. So bounce gets used for quite a few things. Somebody might say like, hey, send me a bounce of that session. That just means they want you to export the final audio for the session and send them one file. Inside of your DAW, you could do something called bounce where, let's say you have a bunch of slices in your audio. Maybe you've, kind of gotten a bunch of vocals together for something like a vocal comp, and you want to combine those all into one audio file. You can bounce them, and what that's going to do is that's going to combine all of the edits that you've made back into one audio file. So now you have it here without all of your splits and cuts. But what bounce typically won't do in a DAW is it won't export any of the effects that you have as your inserts into that new audio file. It's essentially just going to combine everything. Where that differs is you have something called render in DAWs, where that will actually export that track with any kind of effects that you have on it, and it's going to add it back into there. So if I do it again with vintage verb, let's say that we have it at 50% dry and wet, and let's hear it. If I bounce that audio, it's not going to do anything. That audio is staying inside of this actual lane. It's just combining all of those into one audio file. But let's say I want to render it. I can render out this audio, and essentially that is going to now export that audio back into my session with that reverb kind of printed into it. So there's no reverb still on the track insert, however, there is still reverb baked into the track. Let's talk about commit. Commit is kind of just another word for render. So when you hear somebody say, oh, go ahead and commit your guitar tones, all they're essentially saying is go ahead and render those guitar tracks that have those amps on them, so you don't have to keep going back to the actual amp VST, or you don't have to keep going back to the amp that's mic'd up in your corner. Let's talk about the next thing, which is stems. A stem, when you're hearing somebody talk about exporting stems, essentially that's an audio file that will consist of a group of elements, and that's exported as one audio file. So if I ask for stems for a song, typically I'm going to want like a drum stem, a key stem, a guitar stem, and that drum stem is going to have the kick, the snare, the hi-hat, all going to be one audio file. Where that differs is you have something called multi-tracks. So a lot of the time you'll hear people when they're mixing ask for stems, but what they really mean is multi-tracks, which is essentially where you export every track in your DAW as its own audio file. So for instance, if I'm exporting multi-tracks for a session, once I send that to the next person that's going to work on it, they're going to have a kick track, a snare track, a hi-hat track, where if I were to send them a stem, that's just going to be one drum stem. And both of those could have audio completely processed or completely unprocessed. That's just a conversation that you need to have with your collaborator and see what they truly want. The next thing that I want to talk about is the word wave. Typically, that's just an audio file type that can carry lossless audio. So when I'm exporting things like stems or multi-tracks or my master file, or if I'm recording into my DAW, I'm capturing wave tracks. If I look up here, it says that right here, record file type, wave file. The next thing that we'll talk about is the word demo. Obviously, a demo is just an unfinished musical idea or composition. Demos can kind of range from being something very, very rough, like literally just playing keyboard and recording a voice memo, or they could be something that's fully produced out, final vocals are tracked, but it doesn't have a final mix. You might also hear the word WORKTAPE. People will commonly use that as kind of a synonym for demo. Typically, when I hear WORKTAPE, they're a little bit more unfinished and unstructured than a demo. So if I had like a WORKTAPE of a song, it might just be kind of like me playing guitar and having a little drum loop and a vocal idea, and I'm going to call that a WORKTAPE, and then I would go in and actually demo that out or produce that out. There's also going to be the word skeleton. This is another word for a demo that normally just consists of like the bare essentials of a musical composition. So if I say, oh yeah, today I'm just gonna work on like the skeleton of the song. Typically I'm talking about like the main rhythm that's gonna happen, the main, chord composition that's gonna happen, and maybe the main melody that's gonna happen. And that's kind of it. I'm not gonna stress myself out on sound design. I'm not gonna stress myself out on like sound selection. I'm just trying to get the skeleton, the bones of the song together. Now, the next word that I want to talk about is master. There's a couple different definitions for this. Number one, if I ask you for a master file, I'm essentially asking for the final audio file that would be sent to distribution or radio. This is going to be the most finished version of your song. This one's ready to go out into the world. That is your master. There's also mastering, which is the process of bringing a mix or a production to kind of a commercial loudness and to be formatted for commercial use. So it's going to be formatted correctly as a WAV file. It's going to have things like metadata input. You're going to make sure that it's not clipping or peaking. That's mastering. It's the process of taking that audio and really getting it release ready. And mastering can be as simple as making a small little tweak to a song and being done, or really going in and rebalancing tons of the frequencies and dynamics and really kind of putting a stamp on it. But mastering is done with one audio file. So I would essentially export my entire mix as it is, and then a mastering engineer would take that one file, bring it up to commercial loudness, do whatever they want to do to kind of give it that extra little sauce, and then they're going to send me the master file. Let's talk about the next thing, which is a sample. There's a couple kind of definitions for this one as well. The first definition is just a file of recorded material that you're going to use inside of your own project. So if we go to something like this, these are kick drum samples. These are things that I've specifically made. I've processed them, I've exported them, and they're audio that you could use inside of your own session. So those are drum samples. Let's say that like a hip hop song used a sample of Stevie Wonder. Essentially what that sample means is they're using a piece of existing musical composition in their own project, so you have to sample something, which means that you have to get clearance. Typically you'll have to pay the original rights holder, and that is what it's like to use a hip-hop sample, or to like sample a song from the past. If you're going online and you see something that says drum samples, that does not mean the same thing as like, let's say I want to sample In the Club by 50 Cent. It's not the same thing. The next thing is a sample of audio. It's essentially just the smallest little byte of audio that it can possibly be measured. So you'll see things called sample rate, which will be the next thing that we talk about. That's going to be the amount of samples in an audio snapshot within a second. So this is where that third definition comes into play. So if I go into my Cubase session right here, you can see that my sample rate is 44.1 kilohertz. That essentially means that every second of audio has 44,100 samples baked into that. You can adjust this if you want more samples in it. What that can do is give you a little bit more headroom and fidelity. Let's say you want to go to 96 samples. That's going to capture 96,000 samples per second of audio, but it creates file sizes that are a lot bigger. It's a lot harder on your CPU. Then you have something called your bit depth. And bit depth is essentially the number of colors in that digital image that can represent sound. So when your bit depth is really low, think of like 8-bit music. Right? You can kind of hear it crunchy. There's not a lot of fidelity in it, where if you have something like 24-bit, that's essentially super clean. And if you go to something like 32-bit float or 64-bit float, essentially those bit depths are so intense that you can actually undo like clipping audio and stuff like that. There's so much information in that essentially you have infinite headroom. If I'm exporting multi-tracks and stems for people, I'll export those in 32 or 64-bit float, just so in case something is clipping on the output, they can bring that down a little bit later. But typically for my masters and my, kind of day-to-day recording, I just use 24-bit and it works out perfectly. The next thing that I want to talk about is the word loop. A loop is an extended repeated source of audio or MIDI. So if we go up here, we can find something like a drum loop. You could also do something called looping your audio or looping your MIDI, which is where, let's say you record it, and then you just want it to repeat that, you're going to loop that. Now it's going to repeat that again. That's a loop. You can also set a loop point. So essentially you can tell your DAW, once it gets to this certain point, repeat that audio. You can do that with a marker up here. And if we click right there to where it's blue, now it's going to loop. Let's go on to velocity. Velocity is essentially the intensity of which something is played or performed. So if we go into something like Keyscape, what can happen is, like I said earlier, MIDI can kind of capture notation, but it can also capture dynamic. So if you have a library that allows for velocity sensitivity, like Keyscape, if I press really soft, it recreates a piano being played very soft. Hard is very hard versus. So when something's velocity sensitive, that means essentially you can program it to kind of be different volumes and different velocities and intensity. So if I ramp this up, this is my velocity control down here. The next thing that we'll talk about is the word quantize. When you record things, they might be a little bit off of time. If you want to quantize them, that essentially means that you're going to align that to a grid or a subdivision. So right now we're at 120 beats per minute. And let's say I want to quantize this audio to kind of create 16th notes that fall exactly where I want them to. So if I want to quantize to 8th notes, we can go over here to grid size. We can quantize to 8th. And essentially, you can quantize to whatever kind of subdivision you want. What you can also do is you can add something called swing. So swing is when the sound doesn't fall directly on the grid or subdivision. Typically, it will fall a little bit behind it. So let's say you want to increase your swing versus. The next thing that we'll talk about is mono. So you might hear things be called like a mono source or a mono file. Essentially what that means is you have one audio source, you have a single channel where all the sound is coming from one direction. So if I have a mono source, let's go mono, I'm only going to be able to capture audio that comes right down the middle. So even if I have something that, let's say, has a lot going on, right? Like we can all agree that that has a lot of stereo stuff happening. Let's say I want to record like a 10-piece band, but I only have one mono microphone. It's all still going to come from down the middle, because I only have one channel of audio. So when something is recorded in mono, you only get it down the middle. Even if you're recording a full drum kit that's, you know, big and spacious, even if you're recording a big choir, mono, one source up the middle. You can kind of battle that as you can have something called a stereo file, or you can record something in stereo, which means that it'll have two sources, one that can go all the way to the left and one that can go all the way to the right, and it's going to create what's called a stereo field. So if I have a stereo track, now when I drag this loop to it, we get sound that kind of covers the entire stereo field from all the way left to all the way right, versus a mono track. And one way that you can control that stereo field is by using something called pan. So you can see right here we have a pan knob, and you can pan something all the way to the left, which means that it's only going to come out of a left headphone or a left speaker. You can pan something all the way to the right, which means that it's only going to come out of the right headphone or the right speaker, or you can kind of do them in between that parameter and use that stereo field to your advantage. All the way left, all the way right, automating the pan across. The next thing that we're going to talk about is dynamic range. Dynamic range is the difference of the loudest and the softest part of whatever's being captured. So let's say that we're recording a vocal and it starts like this, and then by the end of the song it's sounding like this. That's going to be a high dynamic range because we have a really low signal and then a really high signal, and the difference of those two signals is essentially the dynamic range. If you see something like a mix that says it has a lot of dynamic range, that means that it's going to have really loud parts, it's going to have really, really quiet parts, it's going to have really intense moments, it's going to have less intense moments. So sometimes dynamic range can contribute to something like perceived loudness, because a source might be kind of pulling you in because it's really quiet and really intimate, and then boom, it's extremely loud, and it feels even more loud because you were already kind of cued into something that was a little bit softer and quieter. That's why dynamic range plays such a big part in like mixing and mastering. Let's talk about something called LUFS. LUFS is the loudness units relative to full scale. This is a measurement of loudness for an audio file, and it's normally used to measure the loudness for an extended period of time. So if we come to that kind of dark cinematic track that we have over here, we're going to make sure that we are at 0. And then in Cubase, I can pull up what is called a LUFS meter. So we're going to go to meters and we're going to go to loudness, and you're going to see LUFS. Let's turn off that vintage verb. I'ma make you wanna scream. I don't do things genuinely. Think we're going too far, now we can't turn back. So as I make the song louder, you're going to get a lower number of LUFS. So you're going to go from something like negative, let's see what we are here. Negative 21 LUFS, pretty quiet. If we pull it up to here. Negative 10 LUFS, it's much louder. That's typically how people will measure something like a final mix or a final master, is they'll say, oh, what are the LUFS? I want the song to be negative 8.5. You could also measure things with something called a VU meter. VU meter is going to kind of be just a different way to measure that loudness over time. And VU meters I kind of like because they can be a little bit more sensitive to things like dynamic. And then you'll kind of see this VU meter pulse back and forth. And this VU meter is showing me the amplitude of that audio over time, and it's a little bit more responsive to things like transients and kicks and loud moments than something like an LUFS meter. It's not nearly as responsive as something like a peak meter. So I use LUFS meters to kind of see my extended volume. I'll use the VU meters to kind of see my extended volume with its louder moments. And then when I just need to make sure that something is not clipping or peaking, that's when I'll use something like a peak meter that we used over here when we talked about clipping. So right now we're peaking at negative 9.8. But our LUFS is at negative 16.1. You're going to see, if you're not paying attention to what your kind of monitoring measurement tool is, you might get really confused if somebody's talking about, oh, make sure that you don't peak at over 0 dB, and then you're considering that as 0 dB LUFS. 0 dB LUFS is literally deafening, where 0 dB in terms of a peak meter, just make sure that you're not clipping. I just used the word transient. Let's talk a little bit about what that is. Transient is typically the beginning kind of initial sound of an audio file. A good example is like a kick drum. It's that initial kind of pulse. And typically that's the loudest part of a sound. However, it doesn't have to be. You could have something like a French horn that's not super transient in the beginning, and then it kind of swells over time. But when somebody talks about something being too transient, let's like pull up something that's super transient. You can see this initial little peak right here. That is the transient. So when you look at the transient of an audio, essentially it's kind of this little guy right here. The next thing that we'll talk about is phase. Phase is also really confusing. If you're new, you might want to watch an entire video just talking about phase. But phase is essentially the position of sound or audio within the cycle of a sine wave, and it's also in relation to multiple elements. So if we look at something like a kick drum, let's look at this one. You can see this little waveform right here. This is the audio file, and all of these little peaks and amplitudes is phase. So let's say we wanted to layer another kick. So you can see right here that these are not phase aligned. They get a little bit phase aligned back here where you start to see these kind of peaks and amplitudes kind of match up. But what could happen is if you play these at the same time, some areas like this might kind of cancel out. And what's going to happen is when things are out of phase, you could start actually losing volume when you're trying to add things, because essentially what it's going to do is it's going to cancel out. Again, this gets really, really complicated, but just know that phase is essentially that position of sound. Let's talk about hertz, also called HD. You're going to see these represented on things like an EQ. And essentially, hertz are the measurement of frequency in audio. It's essentially how many times that audio is repeated in a cycle. So low end is going to have a much lower frequency because it's repeated over a much longer wavelength, where something like high end is repeated extremely fast. So if something says it's 50 hertz, that means that it cycles 50 times within a second. If something is 10,000 hertz, that means that it cycles 10,000 times within a second. When you have an audio file, you can kind of see all of the different frequency amplitudes. And you can boost things, you can cut things, you can kind of redistribute where those frequency amplitudes lie. And it's essentially going to change the balance of that frequency in an audio source. That's what you would use something like an EQ or an equalizer for. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is something called latency. Latency is essentially the delay between sound as its input to when it's captured or when it's kind of monitored back. So let's say that I want to record audio into my session right here, and I'm recording. Let's say I have this all armed, we're going. Latency would be, let's say I'm speaking, but let's say when I play it back, that audio is actually happening a little bit later than I needed to. Let's say I have this all armed, we're going. Latency would be, let's say that I recorded that, but it actually input closer to like this. Let's say I have this all armed. That would be latency. You can also hear latency sometimes if you were to monitor things with, like, let's say that we have something like Auto-Tune Pro that will introduce something like latency. And then let's say we monitor this back. Check, check, check. There's a little bit of delay. And that can be extremely distracting when people are recording. So when people want something in their headphones to listen back to or to monitor with, you want as little latency as possible. And when you're recording, you want as little latency as possible for your input so things don't fall off of your grid or fall off of your timeline unintentionally. That's going to do it for this video. We talked about so much in here, so I know it's overwhelming. Again, if you want to download all of the definitions, you can. They're from our website, Make Pop Music. Also, if you like this video, let us know if you want a part 2. We can definitely do that. Leave words or phrases or terminology that you want in the comments down below. And if you want to support us, head over to our website, makepopmusic.com. We have sample packs, preset packs, MIDI packs. We have courses, lots of stuff over there, including free content. Go check it out. But I'll see you soon. Much love. Peace.